Welcome to Block by Block, where we dive into timely topics at the intersection of crypto, tech, and society. I'm your host, Denelle Dixon, CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Development Foundation. My guest today is Sigal Mandelker, lawyer and longtime public servant who served as Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence and held many other senior positions throughout her distinguished government career. Now at Ribbit Capital, a VC focused on financial services and technology, she's leveraging that experience to help change the world of finance. She sat down with me to share what motivated her early on in her career, her approach to engaging with industry for better outcomes, and how that public sector experience impacts her work with founders now. Sigal, so nice to have you on Block by Block. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for asking me.
So we've been working together on several different issues for a while, and I'm just constantly impressed by you. And, well, frankly, your career is intimidating. Your expertise is so valuable. And so I know this is going to be a lot of fun. So I want to start by letting you just give a quick intro. And so can you tell the listeners a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am at Ribbit Capital. For those who don't know, Ribbit is an investment firm, a global investment firm. We're focused on fintech and crypto. We've been around for about 10 years. And if you look at our website, you'll see our mission is really to change the world of finance, meaning to give more people around the world access to more financial products that can ultimately lead to economic empowerment. I've been at Ribbit for about 2.5 years, but my path is definitely not the ordinary path to getting to a venture firm. I've spent most of my career in and out of the government. Most recently, I was both the acting deputy secretary of the Treasury and also the undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, where I oversaw the U.S. sanctions program, the OFAC, anti-money laundering program, FinCEN, a policy shop that did a lot of work all over the world, including leading the U.S. in FATF and an intelligence agency. Before that, I was a partner at a law firm. Prior to that, really starting in the close to immediate aftermath of 9/11, I had a number of senior roles at the Justice Department and Homeland Security, all targeted towards national security, keeping our country safe, going after illicit actors, both in the United States and all over the world.
And what you didn't mention is you've also, before that, after law school, clerked at the United States Supreme Court, which is also a pretty remarkable achievement in and of itself. Not everyone gets to do that. In fact, very few do. So all of this work, prior to your current Ribbit Capital role, it's just really pretty remarkable in terms of all the public service that you focused on. So what was it about public service and the government that motivated you to spend so much of your career there?
So thank you for that question. It's maybe an interesting path, I don't know, but it's actually, if you talk to a lot of people in the government and you ask them that particular question, which is, by the way, very similar for crypto, what you'll find is that many people had something in their history, in their family history, whether their personal history or their family history that led them to public service, whether it's being something about 9/11 really motivated them and touched them, or otherwise. For me personally, the thing that's always motivated me is that I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. So for both my parents thankfully survived. 3 of my grandparents did not. And so, it's just been a central part of my life, right? Like how do we make sure that nothing like that ever happens again? And it's, just something that's always been sort of fundamental to what's motivated me. I think the interesting thing about that is I used to talk a lot about that actually when I was at the Treasury Department, in part because there's this amazing overlap between my family history and how OFAC, the U.S. sanctions arm, started, which was really actually all about keeping money out of Hitler's hands in World War II. So it's sort of like for me was, when I found that out, was a really quite inspiring. But because I used to talk about that a lot, at Treasury and elsewhere, so many people around the government used to come and tell me their stories, like whether people whose family escaped from Iran, others who are Holocaust survivors, people who fled from or survived the Armenian genocide, or people who were the first in their family to go to college. And I say that also in this conversation in part because I've found so many similar threads in crypto, in particular in fintech, right, where a lot of people come to this with something, growing up in an authoritarian government with hyperinflation, or what have you, that motivated them to want to really build something that's fundamentally new and different and can provide much more freedom.
No, I think that I knew about your background and you're part of your the reason for your journey and your story. And I think it's fascinating to see how all of us sort of converge in different ways on what we want to do with our life. And I'm so grateful that you told that. And I think that a lot of people don't have a sense as to like Treasury's impact on all of those issues. And so maybe it would be useful, especially for folks that are outside the US, like what about Treasury? And you manage so many different groups or oversaw so many different groups in Treasury. It's got such a broad swath in terms of the coverage. So how did you figure out like which areas and like what to do with those areas once you got to Treasury?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, part of it was set by, what the priorities, the national security priorities were, at the time. So of course, North Korea, the threat of North Korea continuing to develop its weapons of mass destruction program was a massive priority for all of us, and also a place where we thought that limiting their ability to get access to money could really be very important on the prevention side, and also perhaps bringing them to the table of negotiations. Another piece, Iran was a very important priority, and so that's another place where we focused our efforts, Venezuela, Russia, et cetera. But the other piece is I came into Treasury not long after the Global Magnitsky Act was passed, or GLOMAG. And that's a law that's really focused on using those kinds of tools to go after human rights violators, which was something that was of particular importance to me. So we really built out a program, not just at OFAC, which had where the focus was of GLOMAG, but also at FinCEN with TFFC, our policy shop, and in our intel agency, to develop and implement strategies to use those tools to target human rights violators in a way that ultimately could either freeze their assets or inspire a change in behavior, which was just, again, another thing that I spent a lot of my time on. Another area that was really important to me was to think through as a major priority how we were going to work with the private sector, because I was very much of the view, still am today, that from an illicit finance perspective or sanctions evasion, what have you perspective, we needed to see the private sector as our partners and not as our enemies. So I spent a lot of my time at Treasury focused on providing a lot more guidance to the private sector's typologies, standing up a program through FinCEN where we could bring financial institutions in, including in crypto, to talk to them about what we were seeing in threats on the threat side, to help them better their financial crimes programs and the like. And also, again, just in the spirit of working with the private sector to get them clarity, we did a lot on the crypto side, right, which was to issue both a lot more guidance. So we did that through FinCEN and also through OFAC in various ways, and then a particular focus on working with countries around the world so that they had a similar regulatory regime to the one that we had, which really launched long before I was at Treasury in 2013, where we said, look, if you're in crypto, you're not enemy.
Yeah.
We want you to be our friend. So what we want you to do is do what other people involved in money transfers do, which is to set up a compliance program and, and do financial crimes work and help us go after the bad actors so that ultimately the innovation can really grow in all sorts of, exciting ways that you and I see today.
Well, it's so our listeners couldn't see that I got a big smile on my face when you talked about the way that you thought about the engagement with the private sector, because that is the way to keep U.S. as the leader in so many of these different technological advances. And I know you spend a lot of your time even today working with policymakers and regulators to help them to see the value of what crypto has to offer, and also to have that kind of engagement. And I'm so grateful to have you in our industry to be fighting for that. So it's a really important part of it. And I just wonder, because you did do so much while you were at Treasury, focused on the engagement with private sector, but also recognizing the importance of crypto, both from the illicit and the licit kind of activity that happens there. And how did your team and how did you spot this as the issue that you should spend so much of your time on there?
I think it's probably just that the industry was growing. And when I started at Treasury, there were 3 countries in the world that were regulating crypto from an illicit finance perspective. Literally, that's it. It was us, Australia, and Japan. And, just because I've had a long history, in and out of law enforcement, to me, that was just a red flag that if bad actors want to exploit the technology to do bad things, they're just going to go to the jurisdictions who are sort of not paying attention or don't understand it or aren't focused at all on it. And so that, it was a clear gap. By the way, there are other gaps in our regulatory regime, other industries where there are some gaps, but that was one that was, apparent. And of course, just from somebody whose job it was to keep bad things from happening, using money laundering, whenever we saw that kind of exposure, we were going to think thoughtfully about how to address it. So that's why we took up this mantra of getting other countries to think about the AML side of crypto in the way that we were thinking about it. And we had the presidency of the FATF when I was there, as I mentioned, and we worked with FATF to make it a major priority. By the way, that was before the more recent guidance that FATF has put out that we've also weighed in on, with some of which we think could be improved. But yeah, it was just, it kept coming up. By the way, it was also coming up on the illicit side, right? So yeah. Our objective, not just with crypto, but across the banking industry, right, it was always going to be to minimize the ability of bad actors to use and abuse and exploit it to do bad things. And the way to do that, both with the banking sector, with fintech, and with crypto was through very active engagement. And I say very active engagement and guidance as opposed to just interacting with people through enforcement, because in my view, that never gets us to a better place in the long run, right? It's about bringing people in, engaging with them constructively, learning from them, and ultimately working hand in glove with the private sector.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, because you have spent so much of your time prioritizing working closely with industry while you were at Treasury. And we see today that not all agencies employ that same type of effort and engagement methodology. And there might be reasons and rationales, and we don't need to get into that part. But I do think that one of the ways, we're constantly advocating for clear regulation that enables innovation and that public and private dialogue. And it seems like it really worked for you while you were at Treasury, and certainly with the administration that you were working at during that time. Now, in terms of being on sort of the other side of it, and we think about it as the players that are currently in crypto today and that are facing agencies that may not actually operate in the same way, do you have recommendations or thoughts about how they could approach this kind of regulatory environment especially on issues in crypto?
Yeah, look, my general approach, or my general view on this sector, from, let's say, from a national security perspective, or and from an innovation perspective, is that you want, for many different reasons, the United States or other, Western countries should want companies, innovators, software developers, et cetera, to be able to operate in here, right, in the United States, and the way to do that is really by working with them, telling them what the rules are, giving them guidance, and understanding the technology, right? Like that's such a fundamental part of making good policy, is actually being able to understand what is being built. And I also think that if you believe, as I do, that this sector is going to really, there's a very, very good chance, right? At least that's what we bet on, that that people in this who are building in crypto and in fintech are really building the rails of the future, right? It's the future. Our global financial infrastructure is going to look. It has to look very, very different in 5 years.
It has to.
I mean, it's just so inefficient right now, and there are so many people who, extraordinarily smart people who are building things that I think can ultimately be much, much more efficient, easier to use, fewer intermediaries, or in some cases none, cheaper from a remittance perspective, more effective from a cross-border, payments perspective, et cetera. You can list all the various use cases, the center of the creator economy, for example. And all of that is happening. Like it's happening regardless of whether the US permits it or certain regulators permit it to happen in the US. It's going to happen. And it's fundamentally going to happen because you just have really smart people who are building all the time. And with the view that they're building the next phase of the internet, right? Which is super exciting. I'm not a computer scientist, but if I were, this is what I would want to be doing, because I would be, I would be building something that's going to be extraordinarily impactful from a global perspective. So you have to start with that premise, right? The premise has to be, the first guiding principle has to be, how do we ensure that happens in the United States, or in whatever country you're sitting in, because whatever country it's in is gonna, first of all, there's tons of economic benefits that are gonna result, not first, but one of the things, lots of economic benefits, jobs, et cetera, that are gonna result from this infrastructure. Two, from just a national security perspective, for so many reasons, or illicit finance perspective, for so many reasons, you want the sector to be in your jurisdiction, because then you can work with industry as is what happens today, right? To get the bad stuff out, to allow the good stuff to come in. It's much more complicated to do that when exchanges or developers are overseas. Three, this is if we use it properly, if it's developed in the this is an amazing way in which we can help promote freedom all over the world. And that's a whole nother topic, but one that is very, very exciting. And so how do you do that? How do you achieve that? Well, you achieve that by working hand in glove with industry, by welcoming them in, by understanding the technology, and also by understanding that there are attributes to the technology, which is, by the way, what we saw at Treasury, that make it easier to go after fraud, manipulation, Ponzi schemes, not more difficult, as long as you take advantage and understand those attributes. So on the other hand, when you don't engage with industry and you threaten enforcement, et cetera, what I see is people feel like they have no choice but to go somewhere else. And really smart projects, right? I'm not talking about projects that you wouldn't want to have, like amazing projects that are dealing with energy, environmental issues, et cetera, that are dealing with better remittances. So the guiding principle has to be, how do we make our country a leader and incentivize those projects to come in while working with them to make sure that, you have the right level of protection in place.
Yeah, I love that whole discussion. And I think it's really important that, I'll just be honest and tell you when people started saying to me that there's a real risk that we lose a lot of these crypto innovators and blockchain innovators because of regulation, I was kind of dubious on it. But I actually believe today, just looking at the way that organizations are developing, that if we don't get clarity and we don't make it so that there is direct engagement so that we can understand both sides of it, because the industry has as much of an obligation to present information and the technological advances to the government. That's the best way to have this dialogue happen. And I'm fearful that because of the way that some things are moving, that there's going to be less of a desire to have that dialogue on both sides, frankly. So I really do want the U.S. to lead. I want all of these companies to be here, and as much as you do. And so I'm just hopeful that we can get there. And like your guidance and what you've done historically is really a signal as to how we should continue to operate. So hopefully we'll see that kind of momentum.
I was the same way when people used to come to me and say, it's all going to leave the United States. I was like, yeah, whatever. This is
Yeah.
This is a democracy. The dollar is strong, et cetera, et cetera. Now that didn't guide how I, acted, but like, that's sort of what I thought. And to be clear, by the way, when I was at Treasury, I also was like sending strong signals. You have to have strong compliance programs that
Yeah.
used for all kinds of things. So which was very realistic. But now that I'm on the other side, and part of my job is to work with founders and, all the time, I see it. You talk to any lawyer who's advising a crypto company in the United States today, and many of them will advise their companies just ring fence the United States out.
Yeah, which is the most frustrating advice, although I understand it, because there are so many unknowns and so many challenges and so many gray areas. It used to be like back in the early days of the web, I loved working in the gray areas because it gave you so much opportunity to innovate. And I feel like because we're dealing with money, because we're dealing with that thing that governments know how to regulate, there's a lot of fear on both sides as to what's going to happen. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a better place. Yeah. And that we're going to win in the U.S. with respect to this. And I love what you're doing now in terms of what you've done since you've joined Ribbit Capital. And you talked a little bit about it, how it might not be the most direct path to venture capital, but how did you come to make that decision to move into the venture capital space from all of these years of public service?
Yeah, thank you. And a little bit the private sector too. But so when I left Treasury, I gave myself basically 6 months to figure out what I wanted to do next. You can't, when you're in one of those jobs, you can't actually look for a job because there are too many recusals. So, and I knew what the well-trodden path was, right? I could have gone to a law firm, I had other, people calling me. But I had become very passionate about this particular issue around disruptive financial technologies, because when I traveled all over the world at Treasury, the thing that became really clear to me, and all the data bears it out, is that our banks have massively de-risked in the developing world and in emerging markets. And I thought, I sort of touched on it before, but I thought that's a bad thing. It's also bad that you have, over 1 billion people, or at least as of 2017, didn't have access to financial services who are unbanked. And so I just wanted to figure out, is there some way for me to take all that passion and knowledge, et cetera, and bring it, and put it somewhere in something that I can believe in, strongly. And so I just set out to talk to a ton of people. And along the way, one of the people I talked to was our founder, Mickey Malka. And I wasn't even talking to him about a job, but again, it turned out we had very different professional paths, but I think a really very similar ethos, and had come from a similar place. Also, just thinking about family history and how you think about authoritarian governments. And so he was just somebody I had sought advice from. And about a week later, he called me and he said, I have an idea for you. What do you think about talking? We've always all of our companies are regulated all over the world, and we've always thought about like building out that expertise at Ribbit. What would you think about potentially joining us? And so we started to have conversations, and again, it was sort of like, okay, I could take a well-worn path or go the path less traveled. And I decided, at least for me, to do that. And one of the things that Mickey said, after I accepted was, we're going to change the world of finance. So that's something that's, felt super exciting and different to me. So that's how I landed there.
I love the journey. Like for me, people's stories is one of the things that I think that I feel so lucky to be able to learn. And that's actually allows us to really help to figure out like the next steps for ourselves, but also for where we see industry. And so I love that in terms of like your journey there. And at Ribbit, like you get to the opportunity to work with these new companies and these founders that are like innovating in this space. And does that feel very different from what you had to do before? Or are there similarities in terms of what you're doing now?
It's different, but there actually are similarities. I mean, one of the things that I loved about being a partner at a law firm, frankly, was that all of my clients were doing different things, and I got to learn from them. If you're a litigator or a white collar lawyer, you've got a certain skill set, and then you apply it to lots of different things. And so I used to say that my favorite clients. I loved all my clients, of course, but my favorite clients were my biotech clients because I just got to learn the science. I'm not a scientist, but I got to learn the science. And that's one of the things I get to do here is just learn entirely new fields. And, something I say to people in the government actually a lot is, the people that I get to interact with who are founders, developers, they have huge, big ideas. And it's really energizing to work with them and hear and help them, where we can, but just to really learn from them. I have this, I like to say that in 1993, a friend of mine introduced me to the internet, to the World Wide Web. I was obviously only 5 at the time, but so are you. But
yeah, it feels like not that long ago, but yes, we were very young
exactly. And I said, yeah, this is just a fad. We have DOS. I mean, why do we need this thing called the World Wide Web? And fast forward, many years, and I'm not making that mistake. I decided I wasn't going to make that same mistake twice. It's not a fad. It's here to stay. They're remarkable things that people are building, and I get to, learn about them and help them in any way that I can.
Well, and I think that because of Ribbit's mission to change the world of finance, it feels like it melts so well with what you've done before and what your focus has been. And so you get to push that investing approach and also learn about these new technologies and help to bring them and advance them forward, which I think is the best. It's so funny when you talked about when you were a lawyer and you got to work with all these different organizations and really go deep in the biotech space. I loved that too. I was a trial lawyer and I loved working with expert witnesses on the details of all these different kinds of companies because it just it lets you learn. And one of the things I love about life is just the ability to be lifelong learners in different pieces. So that's what this space has allowed me to do too. So that's what's been really fun. I am so glad that we had this opportunity to have this conversation. We don't get enough to be able to do this outside of this. And so I'm so glad that we sat down and talked about this and I could learn more about your background and your thoughts. This is an awesome, and to share this with everyone out there. So thank you, Sigal, for taking the time with us. And I'm grateful that you were able to do this with us.
Thanks. And thanks for inviting me. And yeah, it's been amazing to get to know you. Denelle, by the way, people often will talk about where are all the amazing women in crypto, and there are so many of them.
So many.
You are definitely, at the top of the list. So it's in fact, there are tons of amazing women who are entrepreneurs and who are building. So it's been for that reason and many, many more, really great to get to know you and work with you too.
Thank you, Sigal, and thank you for spending the time with us.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to Block by Block. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when new episodes are released, and follow me on Twitter to stay in the loop in between episodes. I'll talk to you next time.